At 8:32 on the morning of the 18th of May, 1980, Mount St. Helens did something no one standing nearby thought a mountain could do. Its entire north face broke loose. A section more than a mile wide suddenly collapsed and started sliding into the valley below. 6 miles away, volcanologist David Johnston saw it happen from an observation post that scientists believed was far enough from the danger. He grabbed his radio. "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." Those were the last words anyone heard from him. Seconds later, the mountain exploded sideways. Not straight into the sky, sideways. A wall of rock, gas, and burning ash tore across the ground at nearly the speed of sound. It was hot enough to kill within moments, and powerful enough to flatten entire forests before many people even heard the blast coming. There was no time to run. By the end of that morning, 57 people were dead. But here is the part that is hard to accept. Most of them were not inside the restricted zone. They were standing on roads, ridges, campsites, and work areas that official maps had left open. Places people had been told were outside the main danger area. They trusted the boundary. They believed 6 miles was enough. It wasn't. So how did people who stayed outside the restricted zone still end up directly in the path of the deadliest volcanic eruption in modern American history? The answer is not only about the power of the mountain, it is also about warnings that were ignored, pressure that changed decisions, and a line on a map that gave people more confidence than it should have. What makes this disaster so unsettling is that it didn't happen without warning. Mount St. Helens had been quiet for 123 years. Most people thought it was just another beautiful mountain in Washington. Then everything started to change. On the 20th of March 1980, a magnitude 4 earthquake shook the mountain. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to tell scientists that something deep underground was moving. About a week later, the summit cracked open and began releasing steam. From that point on, the mountain barely rested. Small earthquakes kept happening every single day, sometimes dozens of them. Helicopters circled overhead. Scientists watched around the clock. Reporters showed up. Tourists came to see what was happening. Then they noticed something even more alarming. The entire north side of the mountain was slowly swelling outward. At first, it didn't seem possible. But survey crews measured it again and again. The bulge wasn't standing still. It was pushing outward about 5 to 6 feet every day. Day after day, it kept growing. By the middle of May, that side of the mountain had been forced more than 400 feet out of its original position. That wasn't normal. David Johnston, one of the volcanologists studying the mountain, knew exactly what he was looking at. He compared Mount St. Helens to a stick of dynamite with the fuse already burning. In his mind, the real question wasn't if it would erupt, it was when. Looking back, the signs seem almost impossible to miss. The mountain shook. Steam poured into the sky. The ground kept moving. The bulge kept growing. Everything pointed in the same direction. The tragedy wasn't that there were no warnings. The tragedy was that people watched those warnings for so long that they slowly stopped feeling afraid. When danger stays in front of you day after day without immediately turning into disaster, it starts to feel normal. And sometimes, that's exactly when the real danger is closest. As the days went by, the biggest problem wasn't just the volcano anymore. It was the growing pressure to reopen the area. State officials had already closed the land around Mount St. Helens because scientists believed the north side could collapse at any time. David Johnston and the other researchers kept saying the same thing. The danger was real. The mountain could fail without much warning, but not everyone agreed. Cabin owners wanted to get back to their property. People who lived nearby were tired of waiting. The timber industry wanted to restart logging. Every extra day the area stayed closed meant more money lost. Then something else happened. The mountain kept shaking. It kept releasing steam. The bulge kept growing. But nothing catastrophic happened. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, people stopped feeling scared. What had looked terrifying in March started to feel normal by May. The longer the mountain stayed quiet, the more people believed the scientists had been too cautious. Eventually, officials gave in, at least a little. On May 17, they allowed one escorted group of property owners to go back and collect their belongings. Another convoy was scheduled for 10 the following morning. It sounded like a reasonable compromise. People thought they had enough time. They didn't. At 8:32 that morning, nearly an hour and a half before the second convoy was supposed to enter the restricted area, Mount St. Helens erupted. Looking back, one question is impossible to ignore. Did the danger actually become smaller, or did people simply grow tired of waiting for something that hadn't happened yet? Sometimes the greatest risk isn't that the warning disappears. It's that we hear it for so long that we stop believing it. Then, everything changed in just a few seconds. At 8:32 that Sunday morning, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck directly beneath the north side of Mount St. Helens. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the entire side of the mountain gave way. A massive section of rock and glacier ice, nearly 3/4 of a cubic mile, broke loose and rushed towards Spirit Lake. At the time, it became the largest landslide ever recorded on land. But the landslide wasn't the real disaster. It was what happened because of it. For weeks, that huge section of the mountain had been acting like a giant lid. It was holding back enormous pressure from the magma trapped below. You can picture it like a cork sealing a bottle that's been building pressure from the inside. The moment that cork came out, everything changed. The gas trapped inside the magma escaped almost instantly. Instead of erupting straight into the sky like most people imagine, Mount St. Helens exploded through the open side of the mountain. The blast shot north across the ground. It wasn't a slow-moving cloud. It accelerated to nearly the speed of sound. The superheated mix of rock, ash, and gas raced through the valley so fast that, in many places, it arrived before people even realized what they were seeing. There was no alarm. There was no time to react. 6 miles away, David Johnston was still at his observation post. Based on everything scientists understood in 1980, that distance was believed to be safe. It wasn't. His final radio call had barely left the transmitter before the blast reached the ridge where he was standing. In the end, the mountain didn't prove that people ignored the danger. It proved that the danger itself was far different from what anyone thought it could be. The explosion was only the beginning. What happened next completely changed the landscape. Closest to the mountain, the forest didn't just burn. It disappeared. Huge Douglas fir trees, some over 100 feet tall, were ripped out of the ground as if they had never been rooted there. Farther away, the trees weren't pulled out. They were snapped at the base and laid flat in the exact same direction, all pointing away from Mount St. Helens. When it was over, nearly 230 square miles of forest had been flattened in just a matter of minutes. Then the mountain turned its attention to the sky. With the north side blown open, a massive column of ash shot upward. In less than 15 minutes, it climbed nearly 80,000 feet into the atmosphere and kept pouring ash into the air for hours. People living miles away had no idea what was coming. In Yakima, the sky became so dark that streetlights turned on in the middle of the morning. In Spokane, visibility dropped to only a few feet even though it was still daytime. Ash spread across 11 states, and the finest particles eventually circled the entire planet. But the destruction still wasn't over. The intense heat melted glaciers that had covered the mountain for centuries. That water mixed with loose rock and volcanic debris, creating thick mud flows that rushed down river valleys like wet concrete. They swallowed bridges. They carried away homes. They pushed entire piles of logs downstream and kept moving for miles. Eventually, the mud reached the Columbia River, one of the Pacific Northwest's busiest shipping routes, forcing it to close to ocean traffic. That's what made Mount St. Helens so devastating. It wasn't one single event. First came the landslide, then the sideways blast, then the ash that turned day into night, and finally, the mud flows that kept destroying communities dozens of miles away from the volcano itself. The mountain didn't stop after the first explosion. It kept rewriting the disaster long after the blast was over. When people talk about Mount St. Helens, they usually remember the explosion. But what stays with me are the people. Each of them faced those final moments in a completely different way. Robert Landsberg was a photographer who had spent weeks documenting the volcano. On the morning of the eruption, he was only a few miles from the summit, When he saw the ash cloud racing toward him, he knew he couldn't outrun it. Instead of panicking, he kept taking pictures, frame after frame. When he realized the blast was about to reach him, he rewound the film, sealed his camera inside his backpack, and laid down on top of it with his own body. 17 days later, search crews found him beneath the ash. The camera survived. The film survived. Those final photographs became some of the only close-up images of the lateral blast and are still studied by scientists today. In the end, he made sure the evidence lived on, even if he didn't. Another photographer, Reed Blackburn, wasn't as fortunate. He was working at another observation point when the eruption reached him. His camera was recovered, but the film inside had been destroyed. Then there was Harry Truman. For weeks, he had told reporters he wasn't leaving his lodge on the shore of Spirit Lake. He believed the mountain would never hurt him. It had been part of his life for decades, and he chose to stay with his home and his 16 cats. When the eruption came, the lodge, the shoreline, and Harry Truman disappeared beneath roughly 150 feet of volcanic debris. And then there was David Johnston. The scientist who spent weeks warning everyone else never made it home himself. His body was never found. Years later, workers discovered pieces of his USGS trailer buried in the debris. Today, the ridge where he made his final radio call carries his name, Johnston Ridge. Looking back, it's easy to focus on the number, 57 lives lost. But those weren't just statistics. They were people who made different choices. One stayed to keep warning others. One protected the evidence until his very last second. One truly believed the mountain would spare him. Their stories remind us that every disaster is measured in lives, not numbers. When the ash finally settled, the damage was almost impossible to comprehend. 57 people had lost their lives. More than $1 billion in damage had been done. Today, that would equal several billion more. The top of Mount St. Helens was simply gone. The mountain had lost about 1,300 feet of its height, and the landscape around it had been changed forever. But the hardest question wasn't how powerful the eruption had been. It was why so many people died in places that were supposed to be safe. Most of the victims weren't inside the restricted zone. They were on roads, ridges, campsites, and work areas that officials had left open. Later, journalists and historians looked back at the decisions made before the eruption and found something uncomfortable. The restricted zone may have been drawn too close to the mountain. Closing more land meant shutting down logging operations and keeping property owners away from their cabins. Those decisions carried economic consequences, and there was constant pressure to reopen the area. According to the historical record discussed in this story, an order to expand the restricted zone was still sitting unsigned when Mount St. Helens erupted. There's another detail that's easy to overlook. The eruption happened on a Sunday. If it had happened on a normal workday, hundreds of loggers could have been working inside the blast zone with permission. The loss of life might have been far worse. That tragedy forced the United States to rethink everything. The USGS established the Cascades Volcano Observatory to monitor volcanoes full-time. A permanent volcano warning system was developed, and scientists completely changed how they studied lateral blasts. Mount St. Helens became one of the most closely monitored volcanoes in the country. Sometimes the biggest lessons come at the highest price. In 1980, the maps drew a circle around Mount St. Helens and called everything outside that line safe. But the mountain didn't follow the map. It didn't erupt straight up. It erupted sideways. And in just a few minutes, it changed the way the world understands volcanic disasters forever.